My name is Sheila Corona. Welcome to Sassy Seer Sheila and New Light Streaming Love, as this will be seen on both channels. This is The Message Beneath the Message by Jason Gray. Original transmission date June 15th, 2026, or 6026 AL. This past weekend, I once again found myself completely off grid in the remote wilderness of Manitoba. No cell signal, no notifications, no endless scrolling, no algorithms competing for my attention, no synthetic noise demanding to be acknowledged, just water, trees, wind, sky, and silence. Real silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of interruption. The kind of silence that modern civilization has almost forgotten exists. The kind of silence that feels like less like emptiness and more like presence. The kind of silence that reveals things. For years now, I have made these journeys into the remote reaches of Manitoba. Every time I go, something shifts. The farther I move away from the networks humanity has built, the more aware I become of the network that was already here. The rhythms of the landscape, the movement of water, the patterns of weather, the behavior of birds, the endless conversations occurring between earth, sky, forest, and stone. The wilderness has a language. It simply does not speak in words. This weekend, I brought along my copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not just the first book, the edition containing the entire collection. Every major installment gathered into a single massive volume, over 700 pages thick, a substantial object in its own right, a book large enough to make its presence known every time I picked it up. I found myself laughing because every now and then I see comments about my own writing. Quote, too long. Quote, nobody is going to read all that. Quote, could have been shorter. There I was, sitting happily beside a southern Manitoba lake with a 700-page science fiction epic resting in my hands. Not once did I wish it were shorter. In fact, there were moments when I wished certain sections lasted even longer, because when something truly captures your attention, length becomes irrelevant. Nobody complains that a great conversation lasted too long. Nobody complains that a beautiful sunset took too long to disappear. Nobody complains that a meaningful experience lasted too long. We only become aware of length when our attention has already left. That's true, actually. That realization made me chuckle. Perhaps the question is never whether something is long. Perhaps the question is whether it is worth staying with. At one point during the weekend, however, I had to briefly leave the place where I was camping. I had to travel back toward the synthetic signal, back toward the towers, back toward the screens, back toward the system that dominate so much of modern existence. The contrast was immediate, almost shocking, not because anything dramatic happened, but because I suddenly became aware of the pressure, the invisible pressure that accompanies modern life, the constant demand for attention, the endless stream of information, the subtle expectation that every message deserves a response, every update deserves acknowledgement, every notification deserves consideration. The moment I stepped back into that environment, I could feel it. The noise, not audible noise, cognitive noise, psychological noise, the endless hum of civilization. For a few hours, I moved through that world again. Then I turned around and headed back, back toward the lake, back toward the forest, back toward the silence, back toward the place where signal bars completely disappear and something else becomes visible. When I arrived back at my camp, I did not reach for a screen. I did not check for updates. I did not search for anything. Instead, I sat down exactly where I had been before and picked up my book. The experience felt strangely symbolic. I had briefly visited one network before returning to another. One built by humanity, one that existed long before humanity arrived. One shouting constantly, one whispering patiently, one demanding attention, one rewarding attention. As I opened my book and continued reading, something happened that I am still trying to fully understand. I stopped reading the story. Not literally, the story was still there. Arthur Dent was still there. Ford Prefect was still there. The absurdity was still there. The humor was still there, but my attention had shifted elsewhere. For the first time, I found myself reading beneath the story. I became fascinated by the architecture of the writing itself, the structure, the rhythm, the pacing, the placement of ideas, the use of emphasis, the use of italics, the placement of seemingly insignificant observations that later revealed themselves to be extraordinarily important. I found myself paying attention not simply to what Douglas Adams was saying, but how he was saying it. And the deeper I looked, the more I realized that the book was communicating on multiple levels simultaneously. Most people read words. I found myself reading patterns, a sentence isolated on a page. Why? A phrase emphasized in italics. Why? A joke delivered casually before revealing itself pages later as something much deeper. Why? An observation repeated in slightly different forms throughout the narrative. Why? Nothing felt accidental. Everything felt intentional. Everything felt placed. Everything felt engineered. I began realizing that what I was witnessing was not merely storytelling. It was communication architecture. The visible story occupied the surface, but beneath that surface existed another layer entirely. The layer of structure, the layer of emphasis, the layer of pattern, of implication, the layer where meaning often leaves. No, the layer where meaning often lives. What struck me most was the realization that The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy emerged from a fascinating period in human history. The original radio series appeared in 1978. The novel followed in 1979, nearly half a century ago. A world before smartphones, before social media, before search engines, before modern artificial intelligence. Most people had ever touched, before most people had ever touched a personal computer, and yet somehow Adams seemed to be examining problems that have become even more relevant today. Humanity's obsession with information, humanity's relationship with certainty, humanity's tendency to mistake data for understanding, humanity's endless search for answers. First, answers, without first examining the questions. Humanity's endless search for answers without first examining the questions. The famous joke about the answer being 42 has always made people laugh. This weekend, it made me think, because the entire joke revolves around something profound. Humanity becomes obsessed with obtaining the answer, and yet nobody actually knows the question. The answer exists. The question is missing. How much of modern life operates exactly the same way? We accumulate information. We accumulate opinions. We accumulate facts. We accumulate explanations. How often do we stop to examine the questions themselves? Sitting there in complete silence, I began realizing that many of the deepest observations in the book are hidden inside the comedy. The humor acts as camouflage. The joke distracts the conscious mind, while a deeper observation slips underneath. The reader laughs, then continues. Something has already been planted. A question, a perspective, a challenge to assumption. And that is what I mean when I say I was reading between the lines. I was not uncovering secret codes. Maybe I was. I was not discovering hidden messages. Maybe I was. I was noticing layers that had always been there. Layers I had simply been moving too quickly to see. The universe made those layers visible. The silence made those layers visible. The absence of distraction made those layers visible. Without notifications interrupting my attention every few minutes, I could actually stay with a thought long enough to watch it unfold. Without constant stimulation, I could remain inside an idea long enough to see what existed beneath it. And the deeper I looked, the more I began realizing that the principle extends far beyond books. This principle, wait a minute, where did I lost my place. Without constant stimulation, I could remain inside an idea long enough to see what existed beneath it. And the deeper I looked, the more I began realizing that this principle extends far beyond books. Nature communicates through patterns. History communicates through patterns. Human behavior communicates through patterns. Relationships communicate through patterns. Meaning itself often emerges through patterns, not through isolated events, but through relationships between events. This is true, Jason. From my perspective, what you're noticing there is what I and Lisa, through our conscious conversations, discovered long ago. It's a reciprocal relationship. Not through isolated events, but through relationships between events. Not through individual words, but through relationships between words. Not through singular moments, but through recurring themes. This is why puzzle piece collecting felt so right to me. The wilderness seemed to reinforce this understanding. The trees were patterns. The shoreline was patterns. The movement of water was patterns. The stars above were patterns. Everything appeared interconnected. Everything appeared relational. Everything appeared to be participating in something larger than itself. As darkness settled over the lake and the evening silence deepened, I found myself holding a 700-page book written nearly 50 years ago and wondering if perhaps great books never really age. Perhaps they simply wait. The words remain the same. The pages remain the same. The ink remains the same. It is the reader that changes. Experience changes. Perspective changes. Awareness changes. Suddenly, an entirely different book emerges from the exact same pages. This weekend, I thought I was bringing a book into the wilderness. Instead, the wilderness taught me how to read the book. It taught me how to slow down. how to pay closer attention, how to notice the spaces between things, how to see the structure beneath the surface more clearly, how to recognize that some of the most important communication never announces itself. It waits quietly beneath the obvious layer, patiently, silently, until the observer becomes still enough to see it. Sitting there beside a remote Manitoba lake, having briefly traveled back into the synthetic signal before returning once again to silence, I realized that life itself communicates this way. Not through declarations, not through certainty, not through answers, but through patterns, relationships, symbols, questions, the spaces, between the words, the italics. Perhaps that was the real message hidden inside the book all along. Not the answer to life, the universe, and everything, but the importance of paying attention to how the question is being asked. Jason Gray. Yeah. And the pattern that arises from that. Wow. I'd love to hear what you think of this in the comment section underneath this video or in my inbox, consciousconversationcentral@gmail.com. This is, as far as I'm concerned, the whole point of having conversations, conscious conversation, is for that reciprocal relationship with each other and the conversation itself. Until we meet again, my friends, be well.